We're going to go ahead and invite Michael Abramowitz to come up and dig into his talk here today. Michael is the president of Freedom House, a nonpartisan voice dedicated to promoting democracy. There, he oversees a unique combination of analysis, advocacy, and direct support to frontline defenders for freedom, especially those working in closed, authoritarian societies. Formerly, he directed the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Levine Institute for Holocaust Education, and before that, he led the museum's genocide prevention efforts. He spent the first 24 years of his career at the Washington Post, where he was national editor and then White House correspondent. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and former fellow at the German Marshall Fund and the Hoover Institution. A graduate of Harvard College, he is also a board member of the National Security Archive and a member of the Human Freedom Advisory Council for the George W. Bush Presidential Center. Please join me in welcoming Michael to the stage.
Thank you very much, Betty. It's really a thrill to be here in Pittsburgh. I will say, I was saying to Betty before I came here that I'm a huge sports fan, and my association with Pittsburgh is largely about the Penguins dispatching the Capitals every year at the end of the season, although we've kind of turned the tables in the last year or two. But it's really great to be here in Pittsburgh. I want to congratulate Betty on your new job. It's really important. I'm very empathetic as someone who's trying to work on an 81-year-old, well, actually a 79-year-old organization. We're a little younger than you, but I really wish you the best of luck. And I do think this issue of stimulating greater engagement on the international stage, urging U.S. engagement in the world, that's really part of the Freedom House mission, and I'm very hopeful that I wish you the best of luck because it's really important what you do. So thank you very much. I hope you're not afraid of PowerPoints. I'm actually not a PowerPoint guy, but I thought I have some interesting slides and some pictures that I wanted to show you. I thought I would talk a little bit today about the global crisis in freedom and democracy, maybe speak for about 20 minutes, talk to you about what I see as the trends in the world, what I see, why these trends are happening, and what we can do about them. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about Freedom House, because Freedom House is a very interesting organization. I think our story is very connected to the story of global freedom. We were founded in 1941 at a time of great isolationism in America. Believe it or not, there was something called the America First movement that preceded the current America First movement, and that movement was embraced by many very prominent leaders in American society, academics, businessmen, and they were fiercely against American intervention in the European war. And Freedom House came together around then to really advocate fiercely for America to get involved in the European war and to defeat fascism. And the founders of Freedom House really recognized that America's safety and the future of American democracy depended on living in a world in which democracy was a predominant form of government. And I also mentioned the founding of Freedom House because those pictures on there are of Eleanor Roosevelt, the first lady at the time, and Wendell Willkie, who had run against the Eleanor's husband in 1940 as a Republican nominee for president. He lost, but he came together with Eleanor to be among the early supporters of Freedom House. And it's very inspiring as someone who works there to know that we drew support from across the political aisle for the fundamental principles of freedom and democracy, and that's still the ethos almost 80 years later, that we really, if you look at our board, if you look at the people who work within Congress, it's always R's and D's, independents, people who really share our dedication to these values. As Betty said, we are an organization that has three things in one. We do research, advocacy, and programmatic work on the ground, and that's a very unique combination. There are other many fine organizations that do one or two of them, but we do all three. We work on the ground all over the world in some very difficult places, supporting the work of human rights activists who are struggling for freedom. One of the things we do, for instance, we provide emergency assistance to frontline defenders and individuals persecuted for their religious beliefs, and we advocate in Congress on behalf of tools and support for democracy and human rights, both in the United States and beyond our borders. Just to give you a couple examples of the work that I'm very proud of, Freedom House worked very closely with Bill Browder. Do any of you know who Bill Browder is? He was an investor, an early investor in post-communist Russia. His lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, died in a Russian jail after the Russians brought trumped-up tax charges against Bill's organization. And we worked closely with Bill and other organizations to help get the Global Magnitsky Act passed in the U.S. Congress. And this act is a real game-changing law in the human rights arena and allows the United States to block visas and freeze the assets of egregious human rights abusers and kleptocrats. And this is a way to really hit the bad guys in the pocketbook, and I think this is going to be a very important tool going forward. Human rights defenders, especially those in closed societies, turn to Freedom House for support. You might recall a couple years ago, there was a full-scale campaign in Chechnya against gay men who were being persecuted, hurt, and Freedom House was one of the first organizations to get resources to the organizations helping these men and bringing their stories to the rest of the world and to get that situation stopped. So I'm very proud of that kind of, on-the-ground work that we do at Freedom House. But the thing we're probably best known for is something called Freedom in the World. I don't know if any of you know what Freedom in the World is. Well, sadly, I've got to get it more attention. But this is our kind of flagship product. It is an annual survey of political rights and civil liberties in the world that we've been doing since 1972. And this is the cover. This is from the Hong Kong protests last year. This is the cover of our report that's going to be coming out in a couple weeks. This report does get a lot of attention, especially in policy circles. And we've been quoted by everyone from Condi Rice and Madeleine Albright. John Oliver, the late night show comedian, featured our work in a piece he had a year or two ago. And the Wall Street Journal has referred to this report as the Michelin Guide of democracy measurement. And for me, the most moving usage of our report came in the final newspaper column by Jamal Khashoggi, who you remembered was murdered by the Saudis in Turkey at the Saudi embassy there. And Khashoggi, shortly before he died, he wrote a very moving op-ed for the Washington Post, which talked about the lack of freedom in the Arab world. And he basically cited and relied heavily in that report on the Freedom House scores about Saudi Arabia, which does very poorly in our scores. The story that we tell in our reports is basically fairly simple. If I'm gonna make very simple something that's kind of probably more nuanced than it is. But when our report began being done in 1972, the world was at a crisis point for freedom, I would say. Much of the world was in a communist bloc. There were military dictatorships on many continents, and perhaps it's not linked, but starting in the mid-'70s, there was an incredible wave of democratization that went on around the world. It started in Portugal in 1974. You saw the collapse of military dictatorships in Latin America, and of course here, the image of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was the signature, freedom event in my lifetime. I never thought, growing up in the Cold War, that I'd ever see that happen, but it did happen. And in fact, there was a famous historian who's now actually on the board of Freedom House, Frank Fukuyama, who declared this was the end of history. But of course, it was not the end of history. Frank will say he probably was misinterpreted, but basically over the last 15 or so years, we've seen a rollback in democracy around the world. We're not back to the levels, we're still ahead of where we were at the end of World War II, but the trends are going in a bad direction. This is our famous map of freedom. We look at every country in the world, 209 countries and territories, and we look at how each country performs on a set of key indicators, such as the basic thing, having free and fair elections, but also political participation, freedom of speech, rule of law, freedom of expression, equity, inclusion. We look at a range of issues that have to do with freedom and political right, and then we assign each country a score on a scale of 0 to 100, and 100 being the strongest countries, and 0 being the weakest. The strongest countries, by the way, are always the Scandinavian countries. They always get close to 100, like Denmark, Sweden. The worst countries are typically, I think, Syria and North Korea are vie for the worst country in terms of freedom in the world. And, but we basically divide the world into 3 categories: the green that are free, the purple that are not free, and the yellow that are in between, the partially free. And our aspiration for the world is that the map eventually become green entirely, but I don't know if that will happen in my lifetime. This chart captures what you might call the democracy recession in the world. So every year for the last 13 years, and we'll see what happens in the 14th year coming up in a few weeks, there are more countries that experience declines in their political rights and civil liberties than those that are having an improvement. So these declines are happening all over the world, on every continent, in every kind of country. And I think it's fair to say that democracy across the globe is under a systematic attack. And you have countries like Russia and China that actually China, it's incredible, it's very low and it's gotten worse in the last few years. And then you have even democracies like in the West, in the traditional West, like the United States and Western Europe that have also, they're still free, but there's an erosion of democratic norms and institutions. This is another way of looking at the data, and what this shows is that over the period of this democracy recession, that the share of countries that Freedom House has rated as not free has risen from 22% to nearly 26%, and the share of free countries has declined from 46% to 44%. And just think about this fact, that of the world's 7.6 billion peoples, roughly 37% live in not free countries. A lot of that in China, but in other countries as well. We can talk more about this during the question and answer, but I think there are several things that have gone on that explain this erosion of freedom. I always start with economics. I think the impact of globalization and the economic dislocations of the aughts, of the early part of this century, have fueled a search for an opening for illiberal politicians who are promising different things. There's nothing wrong with free elections, nothing wrong with populism, but often at times, as we've seen in countries like Hungary or Poland, or Venezuela, where the populists take over, they restrict rule of law, rights, and other things. I think another factor that contributes to this is the global immigration crisis. We have, at this time, I think, more refugees and displaced people than any time since World War II, and I think that certainly you see in our own country is fueling, a discontent with democracy. And I think it's also hard to overstate the pernicious impact of countries like Russia and China, which I think really, you have to remember, almost 20 years ago, we thought were becoming more liberal, these countries, but they've actually moved in a more illiberal direction, and they've also not only tried to restrict the rights of their own people, but they've tried to export a form of authoritarianism beyond their borders, and that's another issue that we see at Freedom House. What's really interesting is that a very large number of important and influential countries are backsliding in serious ways, and this shows some of the backsliding countries. I mean, obviously the worst at the bottom, countries like Turkey, which had been ready to join the EU just about 15 years ago, has become the leading jailer of journalists in the world. They've jailed civil society activists. Now, it's interesting, there was a court case in Turkey today that just showed that some individuals that have been accused of trumped-up charges against the government were actually released. So maybe that's an auspicious sign that the rule of law may be reawakening in Turkey, but that's a problem. Egypt, obviously, under President Sisi, has become much more repressive. Russia and China, we talked about. Venezuela, very sad story. of really a country that 20 years ago had been one of the shining examples of democracy on the Latin America is now a dictatorship, really a failed state that has created the worst refugee crisis in the world outside of Syria. And then at the top are the countries that are more democratic that have also been sliding. We'll get to the United States, but just the point being that it's not only the authoritarian countries, but it's also democratically elected governments that are weakening. And I think of the 40 or so countries that we've rated the strongest democracies in the world, at least half have experienced setbacks in political rights and civil liberties over the last 5 years. Again, here is another list of some of the positive cases and negative. I always like to point out that the world is not totally bleak. Tunisia and Myanmar are two countries that have had dramatic improvements in our scores over the last 10 years. Tunisia is really the only country in the Arab world that is a democracy, a functioning democracy. Myanmar, has had a great relaxation of things, but we're quite worried about the attacks on ethnic minorities, specifically the Rohingya. So that their progress has been set back. And then we have the list of the negative countries below. Again, just to mention two kind of success stories, because I think there are silver linings in this. I've looked into Africa, actually, as a place which is actually, there's some interesting things going on. Specifically, two countries. One is Ethiopia, one of the largest and most significant countries in Africa, more than 100 million people there, had basically been a Marxist dictatorship for a long time. And they have a new prime minister. He won the Nobel Prize last year. And he made peace with Eritrea, and he started a political opening there that we're watching very closely. And Ethiopia has been, again, has improved a lot in 2 years. And the other one is Sudan, which personally is of great interest to me. As Betty said, I used to work at the Holocaust Museum, and one of the issues that we worked on there was the genocide in Darfur. If you remember the genocide in Darfur about 10 years ago. And the person accused of that genocide was General Omar al-Bashir. He was indicted by the International Criminal Court, and actually in the last year he was overthrown in a peaceful, largely peaceful. There was one case of massacres, but largely a peaceful revolt that was triggered by non-political doctors and lawyers who had very much were tired of the corruption and mismanagement of the country. And that's an issue that cuts through a lot of these issues that I think is the one sign of hope that these countries that have become more autocratic, their Achilles heel is the economy, corruption, mismanagement, and they're not immune to the same challenges of other of democracies. This is a picture of Hong Kong from the protests last summer. Obviously, Hong Kong is a great story of something that I like to talk about, the universal appeal of democracy and human rights. It's an incredible story. 3 million people out on the streets over the last summer demanding the rights to which China had agreed in 1997 when the one-time British colony was turned over to China. We're not sure where this protests are going to go, but I worry that Xi Jinping is kind of biding his time while he thinks about how to end this. But it's very moving. I was at Washington and Jefferson College yesterday for their democracy symposium in honor of President's Day, and Nathan Law, one of the young protesters from Hong Kong, was there with me. And Nathan's in his early 20s. He's an incredibly brave person. He's been studying at Yale for this year, but he's going back to Hong Kong. And they look to the United States for succor, and so I think Hong Kong's not the only place where there've been massive protests this year. Russia, Iran, Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, many other countries. This has been the year of the protests. This is going to be one of the themes of Freedom in the World for 2020, and I really do hope that this will be a turning point. But I worry that it might take a while because we really are. The forces of repression are very much interested in pushing back against this. An issue I do want to highlight for this group is the issue of technology and democracy. And as I think about the future of freedom, this is really a major issue that we think about at Freedom House. Less than 10 years ago, you remember the Tahrir Square protests and the way in which Facebook was a galvanizing force to bring together protesters. And I think what we found is that the bad guys, if it were, have been much more sophisticated about using technology to bring pressure on activists. And the rise of artificial intelligence, facial recognition, the deployment of disinformation by bad actors to try to undermine free elections. This is of great concern, and I think going forward, how to deal with these technology issues is going to be crucial for the future of freedom. And really, you look at a country like China. Now, the coronavirus is interesting, and it's not clear. Perhaps that's going to, again, be the Achilles heel for China. They've not been able to deal with that. But they've been very adept over the last 20 years at creating what's known as the Great Chinese Firewall. 2 million people dedicated to keeping information away from the Chinese people, that's not approved by the Chinese government. And now we found, and this is our Freedom of the Net report, which is another product we do. They've been very successful at not only repressing their own people, but exporting these tools to other countries. They're going to Vietnam and other countries in Africa to teach them how to repress their people using technology. And so we're very, very concerned about that. That's a big issue. Just want to say a word about the United States. The United States, I just want to say, is a very free country, but its decline, the erosions of democratic norms here is part of the global story. And I would say, on a nonpartisan basis, this weakening did not begin with Donald Trump, but the trend has continued. And over the years, there's been a variety of reasons for the score decline in the United States: the legislative gridlock, polarization, influence of money in politics, the failure to protect against election interference by foreign governments. But the bottom line is that the U.S. has slightly lower scores than its peers in such areas as election integrity, conflicts of interest, and the rule of law. So overall, we are lower than other countries to which we are often compared, such as England and France and Germany. Why does this matter? Well, obviously, we care about democracy in the United States. We want democracy to be strong here. But what matters, what happens in the United States also has an outsized impact beyond our borders. Other nations watch what is happening in the United States, and they take cues. So we did a report in our Freedom of the Net report a year or so ago, and we looked at the proliferation of laws imposed by other countries that are essentially cracking down on the press, on internet bloggers, in the name of combating fake news. So that's been a great export from the United States. And so I do think, as the head of an organization that works very closely with human rights activists around the world, people do pay attention to what's happening here. So what should be done? I don't have a magic bullet to this, but I'd like to, because we're a U.S. audience, and I do think that the U.S. role is important for the reasons, I'd like to just suggest 3 things that I think we can do here in the United States to address the problem I've outlined. Number 1, I think we can make a much stronger case for the virtues of democracy and its crucial connection to our prosperity and security. And I think, sadly, this is not as self-evident to many of our fellow citizens as it might be to us. But there's a new report that I'd recommend from the University of Cambridge in Great Britain, which analyzed polling data across more than 150 countries. And it came to the really disturbing conclusion that satisfaction with democracy has been declining over the past decade, including here in the United States. And much of this, I think, has to do with the perception that democracy is not delivering for people economically. But I think it also reflects, to some degree, a lack of understanding at home and beyond our shores of the extraordinary accomplishments of free peoples and free markets since World War II. We can't entirely predict what the world will bring if it's refashioned in the image of Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or Hugo Chavez or Viktor Orban of Hungary. But we can safely assume that it'll be less free, less prosperous, more violent, and less stable. Second, I do think the U.S. needs to kind of get its own house in order. I've mentioned the erosion of U.S. democracy. As a former journalist, I want to put this in some context. We have a very robust press in this country, And in many ways, U.S. democracy is strong. But we have our work to do to make it better. And I think from where I sit at Freedom House, there are a lot of really amazing organizations and movements that have cropped up over the last 5 to 10 years that are really aimed at defending U.S. democracy and nourishing a more vibrant civic culture. So there are groups to promote civic education, to combat partisan gerrymandering, to reduce polarization, to limit the influence of money in politics, to make the criminal justice system fairer, to explore ranked choice voting and other reforms intended to give average voters more of a say, countless other worthy causes. And many of these causes, such as criminal justice reform, are drawing support across traditional ideological divides. You saw Republicans and Democrats come together behind a big bill in the U.S. Congress last year. And I think also you have other reforms that are taking root at a state level. So some of this is going to take some time to bear fruit. But I don't believe that you can say democracy is dying in America. But I think if we can revive our democracy, we'll be in a much better position to really do something which I think is very important, which is to restore democracy and human rights to the centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy. And some political figures, including sadly our president, have often argued the United States can no longer be the world's policeman. But I personally think that that's a misleading framing of the argument. Creating a false choice between military overreach, which is a sincere problem, it has been a problem, and indifference to the freedom of others. And democracy has not just been encouraged through the barrel of a gun. America has successfully promoted freedom through shrewd diplomacy, non-military forms of pressure, and our own example as a flawed but a just and welcoming society. And that said, I do think it's incumbent upon us to think of new ways and really a new vocabulary to support democracy as part of our foreign policy. I think the idea of democracy promotion, that word has been tarnished a little bit in some measure because of the Iraq War and what happened in Libya during the Obama administration. But I do think there are many non-military ways to really support democracy beyond our borders. And one of them I mentioned earlier, which is this Magnitsky Act, which has been really an underused tool. I think there's lots more that we can do. By the way, not just government, but universities need to be speaking up for academic freedom, and businesses have to defend these causes as well. I just, in closing, want to remind you that the story that I began with, that when Freedom House was founded, the United States was experiencing very much a crisis of spirit that was similar to what's happening today. We had closed our doors to immigrants, and much to our shame, we had closed our doors to refugees from Germany and from Hitler. Our trade policies were highly restrictive, and our willingness to join the war against fascism was very much in question. And while President Roosevelt understood the nature of the challenge, many of our elected officials, business leaders, and intellectual icons did not. Now, fortunately, today, we're not facing something as existential as Hitler, and our challenges of a different nature. But we have to concede that the direction is wrong, and that's why, even as we acknowledge and seek to rectify democracy's deficiencies, we continue to make the case for democracy, and we do so without apology. We, at Freedom House at least, we reject the view that America must retreat from the world, that America must look to its own interests and only its own interests. In our view, America has been most successful when it is open to the world, sought alliances with our friends, and when facing the choice between freedom and repression, we opted for freedom. So I'm going to stop there and take some questions.
Could you explain this act again that was passed long ago, this Magnitsky Act? Exactly,
Yes.
What was that? What did it do?
Yes.
And how is it relevant today?
The act was a response in the U.S. Congress to the kind of corruption and human rights violations first in Russia. So what happened is this gentleman that I alluded to, Bill Browder, who wrote a really amazing book, which is one of the best books I've read on this subject in recent years. I'd highly recommend it, called Red Notice. It's a very easy book to read, 200 pages, and it kind of lays out the whole story. But Bill was an investor in Russia in the 1990s, and he made a lot of money. But then he kind of inspired the enmity of the Kremlin by talking about some of the corruption inside Russia, and the Russian authorities kind of turned against him. Bill got out of Russia, But this gentleman named Sergei Magnitsky was his lawyer and was arrested and basically tortured to death inside of a Russian jail. And Bill was very angry about that, understandably, and worked with different organizations like Freedom House and others to get the U.S. Congress to pass legislation that would impose visa bans and impose individual sanctions on the people that were culpable in Magnitsky's death. So it started off as a bill to really focus on the Russians responsible for Magnitsky's death. Then the U.S. Congress, on a bipartisan basis, and this has been a bill that's basically been supported across the political aisle, passed a second piece of legislation called the Global Magnitsky Act. And that basically gave the Treasury Department the tools to impose individual sanctions on individuals who commit egregious human rights violations or are, steal money from the state where they're from. So this is a kind of a breakthrough, I think, in kind of approach to human rights, because typically, with sanctions, like in Iraq in the 1990s, you would impose sanctions on a whole country. In this case, it's much more targeted. You target, individuals who are responsible, for the violations, and you kind of hit them in the pocketbook. You say you freeze their assets that it might be in a U.S. bank, or you ban their travel because they want to travel to the West, or they want to put their money in U.S. banks or in British banks, and so you make it very hard for them to do it. I believe since the Magnitsky Act was passed, you have about 200 different individuals that have been sanctioned. And actually, this is an area where the current administration has been fairly aggressive in trying to use this tool. I think they have not used it against some of the really big people that are accused of these violations. So for instance, there's been a movement in Congress to put MBS, the leader of Saudi Arabia, on this sanction list, and the administration has not gone along with that. But I think it's going to increasingly be a tool that will allow the U.S. government, and I should say other governments, because Browder has gone around the world and gotten, other countries, the Canadians, the British, and others. The new British foreign secretary is really a fan of this. So the idea is to make it very difficult for people who profit from their ill-gotten gains to profit. That's the basic nutshell of the bill.
Is the justice system an important aspect of the score? And to go to current events, I believe even as we speak, there's an emergency meeting of a group of 1,000 federal judges. Do you have concerns about our justice system in light of events occurring this week with the U.S. Justice Department?
Yes, well, two questions. Rule of law is a major factor in our scores. It's one of the indicators we look at, and we look at issues, like, is the justice system, fair? Is it transparent? Does it deliver equal justice? And that's definitely something that we look at. So that's point number one. Point number two is, one thing I'm actually proud of at Freedom House is the fact that we do look at the United States as part of our analysis. So every time we do a report, whether it's Freedom of the World, Freedom of the Net, Freedom of the Media, we not only look at what's happening outside our country, but we look at the United States. And as I've indicated there's been some erosion in our scores over time that reflect in part some issues of rule of law. On the specific issue of the Attorney General and the handling of this case, this is the kind of issue that we would be concerned about at Freedom House. Making sure that the rules are followed impartially and that justice is not bought by a favored person. So it's the kind of thing that we would look at. I'm not trying to escape your question, but we look at things on a calendar year. So the report that's going to come out in March will look at what happened in the United States and other countries in 2019. So the issue that you're talking about, I'm sure will be a source of discussion when we come to do our scores for 2020. But it's definitely the kind of thing we would look at.
My name is Ambika. I'm in 10th grade. And my question is, what can the average student or young American citizen do to help reverse the decline of freedom in the United States?
I think it's a great question. And again, there's not a single magic bullet. So my advice is, number one, register to vote and vote. I think that's very important. In fact, the basic civic obligation. I think number two, volunteer. There's just a lot of groups around the country, in this community that work on these issues. Pick a subject that you really care about. It could be criminal justice reform. It could be the influence of money in politics. It could be, civic engagement. There's just a lot of great issues. Get involved and speak up. I really think that speaking up is a very important thing to do, and not being silent. So those are three concrete things that I would recommend.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. It was very interesting. And I'm glad you concluded by talking about the distinction between military overreach and non-military democracy promotion. And I think you're exactly right that democracy promotion, sort of at the point of a gun, has been tarnished the whole idea in the last few years with Iraq and Libya, and you could probably add Honduras and a number of other places around the world. But I'm wondering, more broadly with regard to U.S. foreign policy, we, of course, support heavily a number of the countries that you mentioned at the beginning as major problem areas, such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, Pakistan, and so forth. How would you suggest we perhaps change our foreign policy to avoid this kind of support of repressive regimes? And how would you perhaps change other aspects of our policy as well with regard to our own repression of journalists? I'm thinking in particular here, if you're willing to comment, on the Julian Assange case, a publisher who brought huge amounts of information to the world that were used by governments around the world in many ways, and we have indicted him, and he's been sitting in prison in Britain for about a year in basically a isolation situation. Anyway, interesting in your comments, please.
I think, when I talk about this, I say this with some humility, knowing this past. I think that, a U.S. president is always going to have to balance, national interests and human rights and democracy. And, I used to cover the White House. I followed American presidents for a long time. You are never going to have a situation in which the president's only going to be looking at a human rights thing. There are other situations. There's economic interests. In the case of Saudi Arabia, there was for a while, although I think it's less. Oil, China, their trade issues. So it's always a balancing act. And I'm not here to say that this is the only thing that has to be part of U.S. foreign policy. But from where I sit, I do think that we've gotten away from the idea that America, should speak out or be critical of these kinds of things. It's, I think, and I don't know the politics of the room or it's more observation. I think of, President Bush. President Bush did make it clear to the Egyptian government, that he was unhappy and that he didn't approve of the, of what Mubarak was doing. Now, that's maybe not enough, but the point is there's a way to communicate that there's a working relationship that you have to have, but you don't have to kind of be fulsomely just focused on pure national security interests. And I think my point of view, which I tried to enunciate in the speech, is that I do think that in the long term, we will benefit from a stronger promotion of these kinds of values, like rule of law, as an example. people are not going to want to invest in China or Russia in the long term, I think, if they feel that their investments are not protected. So I think it's in our interest for the United States to be promoting the rule of law, which is part of what we're looking at. And so it's a balancing act. I feel like in the last 10 to 15 years that the balance has gotten a little bit out of whack, perhaps. But I'm not going to sit here and say that this is the only issue that we have to deal with, but I think it's an important issue. And I think people do expect, as they heard from Reagan or from FDR or from JFK, really strong American support for these values.
How do you think action on climate change has been impacted by the erosion of democracy in the U.S. and worldwide?
I'm not a strong student of climate change politics. Dealing with democracy is like a full-time job. But it is interesting to me that our own democracy has not seemed to really address the problem, where some of the autocratic countries, like China, have been more aggressive on that. So that's a challenge for us to think about. I wish that countries in general would be taking a more aggressive stand for climate change. I do think that in the end, democracies, as messy as they are, because of their openness, because of their capacity for renewal, are better equipped to handle some of these global challenges. But there are things that kind of come along that make it difficult sometimes. So that's a little bit of a hedge there, but it's an interesting question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Bree, and I'm a senior at Montour. I was wondering, what got you into this career? What made you want to do this as a full-time job?
When I was at the Washington Post for about 25 years, and I loved the Washington Post. I loved being a journalist. I never thought that I would do anything different than be a journalist. And then an opportunity came to go work at the U.S. Holocaust Museum to work on issues of combating genocide, of combating anti-Semitism, hate, indifference. And I thought that I wanted to be more actively involved than being a bystander. As many people are, I'm also influenced by my parents. They were diplomats. They traveled the world, and they were very engaged on issues of protecting refugees, and that was also inspiring to me. So a lot of life is kind of serendipitous, but I think it was really a desire to move from a more observing role to being more active, and so that led me to the Holocaust Museum and then to Freedom House, which thankfully asked me to be the president 3 years ago. But thank you for your question.